I think I was pleasantly surprised by how much overlap, as David said so cogently, between those different groups in terms of where there is obviously commonality amongst our discussions. A few things that kind of came to my mind as I was listening. We've implicitly skirted round, but talked about explicitly in a few places, the notion of just transitions. So if we are going to transform, how do we transform in a way that is fair? And this is really at the forefront of my mind. On Tuesday, I had a meeting with people coming from a country where coal is still a major driver. Last week, I had a meeting with oil executives, and what's really holding back some of the fossil fuel transition is the power of that incumbent lobby and the issues that, well, if Poland's not going to run its country on coal anymore, what happens to the thousands of people who are coal employees? And UK went through that with steel industry, and as has the United States. And I think if we were back in the 80s, there would be a whole lot of argument around how we can't suppress smoking because of losses of jobs in the tobacco industry. And wherever we look now, the world is changing fast, industries are changing, they're being disrupted, jobs are changing because of AI. We've got to start creating a more sophisticated mechanism for dealing with losers as well as winners in this. And it's not just a livestock industry within agriculture, it is a generic thing that if we are going to deal with the challenges of this century, we have to get smarter about being inclusive and just in the transition. I know if Tim Lang were online, he would be talking about the issues around the political economy, and very much Ian's just been talking about it in a sense. How do we make these issues politically tractable so that they're not vote losers? And part of that issue is in the politicisation of these issues so that the citizenry understand and want to vote for climate action or a better food system or whatever it is. Another aspect of this, I think, is the issue, Ian and I were talking about it the other day, about how much we sit, or governments sit, we as scientists often sit in disciplinary or sectoral silos. So certainly, if you think about the cognate departments with an interest in this in the UK, there are 12 or 13 of the government departments which are absolutely integral to thinking about transition of the food system. And yet the mechanisms by which we can do cross-government action are really quite weak. And part of the issue, I think, is how do we actually adapt our government to deal with these challenges as well. We've talked a little bit about power relations, and they are clearly absolutely key. I had a conversation with a sugar-sweetened beverage manufacturer, a director of a major corporation, who said, I can't tell you who it was because it was under Chatham House rule, but effectively he said, I know our business model is in selling obesity, and on one dimension we virtue signal by saying we're doing all of these things to make our products healthier, but to be honest, we're making so much money, we're going to do everything possible to continue with our business model until we're absolutely forced. So how do we develop that kind of notion in industry that there are opportunities ahead that might be just as beneficial and manage them when we can't deal with that? So those are just a few reflections from me. The final one is, whilst I buy very much Ian's point about this is a decadal transition, and if we're talking about 2040, 2050 for zero net carbon, we also have the issue that there is real urgency in action. There is urgency from a public health perspective, clearly, but there is also urgency from a climate tipping point perspective. So there are, the models are not very good at characterizing tail risk. So we can't predict extreme weather in any meaningful sense. And what we're seeing empirically is extreme weather is moving far faster than models are predicting. And we can't predict with any meaningful accuracy where the jet stream is going to go in future. So we can't predict, that's the major determinant, of course, of weather in this country and in the UK. And there is plenty of places where climate tipping points could actually relatively radically reorganize the world's economies. So if we lost the overturning circulation, for example, we'd lose about a third of the capacity of the world to produce food. And if you've got 10 billion people on the planet and we're only producing food for 7 billion, there's no way that the economy will continue in any way that looks at all familiar to us. So we've got to deal with the fact that politically this is not tractable. Incremental steps have to be made, whilst at the same time recognizing that unless we're moving relatively fast, things are going to get potentially quite sticky. Or, again, Tim Lang, I think, might say, were he online, we're just going to have to wait until there is a sufficiently disruptive event that unloosens some of these shackles of power and lock-in that allows us political space to make more rapid change. And if that is the case, are we as a community ready with solutions off the shelf to advise about new ways of doing things if there is a new economic reality that is based on much less trade or a very, very, very different social contract with people, with citizens? So some reflections from me, but let's open the floor. We've got 20 minutes or so of broad space for discussion. It would be interesting to hear other people's views on what they might be taking from the discussions we've had over the last day and a half. Ratan, first hand up.
I agree with you. There are a lot of overlap, and that was a very good sign. I think there was one thing missing in all of them. I believe the reference to Sustainable Development Goals of the UN should appear somewhere. And I think that might be in the preamble or introduction, whoever synthesizes all these 5 reports into one. That sustainable agriculture is critical to achieving goal number 1, and poverty, goal number 2, and hunger, goal number 3 on water or education, 6, climate, I think 13 is climate, 15 life. That sentence will link us with the UN's idea of what sustainability is.
Yeah, indeed. I can think of 2 or 3 papers that effectively say that food is crucial to delivery of all of the SDGs, including peace and justice, of course, because without food we don't have stable societies. Thoughts, comments, anybody else? If everybody's running out, David.
I will try not to be a broken record, but I'd like to. I want to reiterate what I said when we adjourned last evening. I think we should look at the opportunity for the Royal Society and the National Academy to partner maybe with other academies around the world in establishing at least a forum like this on a regular basis, and preferably a much larger program that could integrate across all the different disciplines that we need to have, all the ones here and some that aren't here. Okay, yeah. Because this is truly a major and critical global challenge we face for human health, for the environment, for the long-term sustainability. We really have to have a way that we can go forward with all the creativity from every branch that might be relevant in the future.
And would that be a synthesis of evidence community? Would that be a ideas and talking community like we've got at the moment? Would this be getting together to actively deliver research projects if funded community? How would you see that?
I would like it to be able to be all of those, but that depends on how much we can, how much pay-in we can have to actually fund things. It would be the least it has to be is a way to communicate and to share ideas that don't otherwise get shared because we're in different floors, different buildings, different universities. What it would be ideal would be to have it be a way to fund a whole nother generation of upcoming scholars with PhD support and postdoc supports and so on, as well as having money for major research that would address these kind of questions we're talking about. Right now, the kind of support in agriculture and food and health is really minor compared to what we really have to have it be. And especially then in policy and in changing the minds of the general public. I mean, these are huge challenges. Yeah. But the best we have is 30 years to get it done.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Cogent as always. Yeah.
Can I jump on that comment on changing the minds? Because I think this is, since everybody's saying there were so many overlaps, and I agree, but I think there were also an extreme bandwidth of approaches to how we see and interact with the general public. One group suggested that we have positive messaging and almost paternalistically put plates in front of people in certain orders, which implies that we know what's good for the public, and the point is to get that across. And then another group ended up on almost the opposite end with a public engagement that at the very least listens, even if that engagement exercise doesn't have teeth in the sense of being binding. At the very least, it's what Alan Leshner, CEO of AAAS here in the U.S., American Association for the Advancement, more than 15 years ago called this honest bidirectional dialogue that we need to have about both the perils and the pitfalls of science. And I think that is one that this group needs to resolve for itself, because there may be some areas where, yes, the science and the communities around agriculture know what's best. And there may be others where moving forward really does require building large-scale consensus rather than this top-down paternalistic, and I'm saying that somewhat facetiously, but paternalistic way of communicating. And I do think that's one that requires a bit more thought and maybe a bit more learning also from other communities that are struggling with the exact same problem right now. If those are other scientific communities and or other areas of technology that are working through the exact same complexities. So I think there's also room for collaboration there.
Thank you very much. Tom.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I just wanted to build on that point. I think there's a major issue with the way we fund science. I think there's a lot of primary research which is funded, and obviously that is hugely important, and blue sky research is hugely important. But I think increasingly, in the face of the urgency of these challenges, there's a whole area of very applied sort of translational research, which doesn't really have a home in terms of who funds that. The funders often push that back and say this is not new, novel research. It's not state of the art. So it should be commissioned by government. But then government, at least in the UK, have pretty much all the money now comes through the research councils for research, with very little for commissioning. So just to give an example, we talked about those kind of regional hubs where local communities might have options about what they do. Local government as well, saying, okay, well, should we ban cars from our town centre, or should we convert this piece of land, buy it off this farmer and turn it into a biofuel plantation? These kind of questions that are very applied, and there's research that could be done to explore what the outcomes would be in terms of environmental, social, economic outcomes of those decisions. But actually, there's no kind of facility which provides that research, and I think that's a real issue.
Thank you, Tom. Ian.
Thanks. I certainly agree with what Tom said there. I mean, I think we do need to be very much more focused in our research investments. However, I sort of get a feeling of a tremendous sense of frustration amongst everybody here and probably in the wider community that, there's a problem, and it's an obvious problem, and somehow we are unable to enact the appropriate processes to try and get that problem solved in some way or other. And we're not really even sort of moving in the right direction. It's just static. I think that's the way I read it. And I think that what we need to think a bit more about is, yes, we need to do research. That's what we're here to do. That's what we are. We're researchers. But actually, there's a bigger issue here, and that's one around politics. And in democracies, that's what makes the process work, and it's how we represent our own view, and I think the collective view that has been expressed here in the last couple of days within that political setting, that is really, really important, and we do not get that right. And I think it's because of who we are. We're scientists. We are not politicians. We tend not to think like politicians and work like politicians, and we do not have a democratic mandate. Now, I don't have a solution to that, but it is fundamentally where our problem sits. Now, I think one of the powers that we have here is that we've got the National Academy of Science, we've got the Royal Society, both of which are institutions with strong representation at the centre of our respective governments. I can't speak for the National Academy of Sciences, but I can see the Royal Society having very significant influence in certain specific policy areas in the UK. I keep pressuring them to broaden that influence and be much more clever about how they work that political field. Because actually the only way we're going to get our voices heard is within that context. Now, for many people that's difficult because it sounds like politicising science. We really don't want to politicise scientists. But the reality is that we have a message to give and we're not giving it effectively, and we need to find better ways of doing that. I'm afraid I think the kind of deliberative processes with the public they're good, and we need to do that better. But actually, we need to do it better alongside a very directed process within the political spectrum. And right now, we don't get that right.
Thank you, Ian. Rachel.
Just to follow on from what Ian said and also what David Tillman said and what someone in our breakout group said, it might have been you, Tim. So why is it that we can't change things? Well, how do we change things in the climate change world? Not that we have yet, but we've got our foot on the bottom of the ladder with the Paris Agreement. So and I'm not familiar with much of what the UN does outside the IPCC either, but there was a suggestion that we need an intergovernmental panel on sustainable agriculture feeding into a UN framework convention on sustainable agriculture. So.
Thank you, Rachel. Any other thoughts, particularly on the role of the national academies? And I mean, I certainly work in many countries in the developing world, and I was part of the Inter-Academies Partnership Group that did the report on food security a year or two ago, and that had quite big reach. So we're not only talking about the national academies leading our governments, but potentially at the national academies, the two premier academies in the world, showing significant international leadership in this space. Any other thoughts around how we can perhaps help unlock some of these things? Yes, sir.
I have just two suggestions. One is, I think I really enjoyed my participation here. I have learned a lot, and particularly in areas that really involve the US and UK and Europe. But if there is a future session, I would like representation from the developing countries so that we really form a kind of comprehensive idea about sustainable agriculture, because it involves everybody, so this is for the future. And with respect to the intergovernmental panel, there is, I think, a group in FAO that is dealing with agriculture. I just want us to really find out exactly if there is that space, because I know governments are represented dealing with FAO offices. They talk about food, agriculture. So I just want us to really find out what exists there. Thank you.
Does anybody with strong FAO connections want to address that? I mean, I certainly know I'm on the fringes of planning for the World Food System Summit next year, which FAO is playing an integral part of. And one of the main strands of that thinking is doing exactly what Rachel said, suggesting the need for some sort of international panel, not necessarily an intergovernmental UN panel on food systems to explore the contested spaces and present at least evidence syntheses, not necessarily seeking for unanimity, but why some projections on the future of food say we need to double food production, and others are saying, particularly the climate ones, we need to reduce food production, and so on. Why is there so much contested space in that? Certainly, FAO is very interested in this space. But I think it does have, it clearly has global reach, developing world particularly, but I'm not sure that it necessarily is a way into rich world governments in the way that it is into poor world governments. But any other questions, thoughts? Michael, I thought we'd hear from you.
I suppose we've skirted around it, where we haven't come and said, actually, we need to engage more collectively with the retailers. I'm sure all of us have connections to certain retail groups, but there were a few major companies that have such power with their supply chains as well. Walmart, Tesco, Sainsbury's, across if you look at the US and the UK. And each of them are doing their own sustainability components, either a sustainability basket or looking at different metrics which drive a sustainable food system. But collectively, you know, the forum could help bring those together and have a workshop on thinking how this moves, because this has to be pre-competitive. You know, a sustainable diet is not going to be different if you shop at Walmart or you shop at Tesco. So therefore, we need to be collectively working together. And maybe that's something that we could work, because they have real great powers within the supply chain to make real difference very quickly.
Yeah, and I wouldn't exclude food producers like Unilever or players in the chain like Tyson or Cargill or others from that debate. Sue.
So that sort of leads to another thought about what a future meeting might look like. To be sure, we have some of those people from those large retail and private sector who are launching sustainability drives from within. They're driving breeding, they're driving packaging, they're driving transportation, they're looking for ways to manage the food waste issues. And I think some of them have thought a lot about it. And what might be helpful for us is to just avail ourselves of their thinking if they would share some of their thoughts. And in the arena of both sustainable diets and the sort of agri-food system in general, and maybe Sally can address this more specifically, this is an area where they have invited the public sector to engage with them and to help them both measure and advocate. And those who have long-term thinking, and most of the big ones do, may be ahead of us. So, Sally, do you have anything you could add to that?
I was just looking up while you were talking, the Field and Market Coalition that we have in this country, which is a coalition of all the major food companies, seed companies that work on sustainability. They do benchmarking for sustainability. They work directly with farmers. They give rewards to farmers so that farmers can meet their sustainability goals. You know, I think when we think about sustainable agriculture, nothing has been more powerful than what the food companies have done to sustainably source. And that's changed the whole tenor of how agriculture is done in this country. And so in that regard, bringing these partnerships together that are benefiting the public, it's in their public good space, but it's also profitability. And then working directly with the farmers has been really outstanding. So, and they work together. So all the companies have to agree on benchmarking principles so that the farmers can meet their sustainability sourcing guidelines. And most of it is about reduced inputs, about there is some carbon sequestration requirements by some of the companies, all sorts of things. So I see that as really the goal. And in science, then on top of that, they add on the science to do all this benchmarking that they're going to need to do. And that's where we all come in, because we help with the science and bringing the science to bear on that process. I think that's really, it's both a top-down and a ground-up kind of partnership. And I think you're going to need both of those to make that work.
Yeah, and I see you, Biana. If you look at what nature journals are doing, Philip Campbell has said on numerous occasions that they want to go from being a publisher of stuff that is pushed to them, i.e. the academic community, to leading the pull of developing the right sort of science. And I co-chair with a bunch of other people, Nature Expert Committee on Sustainable Supply Chains, because they are working with industry, working with civil society organisations, because they see that there is a real potent means of shaping the way that science goes. And I wonder whether or not there might be roles for the national academies to do similar sorts of things based broadly on the kind of Eat Lancet type commission. Liana.
Yeah, just on that point in getting retailers in the room, there are already sort of initiatives that are getting them together. We have, in the UK, we have Courtauld Commitment, which gets all the major retailers together. And they have actually just announced that they have targets in place for food waste reduction and carbon reduction. They have announced that they're kind of on target to achieve those targets by 2025. And there's Cool Food Pledge, which is more US-based and more international. So we can maybe link up with those. But going back to this, is there a need for some international government collaboration? I think there is, because I've been in the room now with 3 different governments in the EU, Slovenia, Sweden, and the UK, and there is a lot of confusion about how they should plan their food system. Sweden, for example, doesn't know whether they should plan to sort of start exporting more because climate change is coming, and they might be more their land suitability might increase, and should they try and plan to feed the world? Should they try and plan to reforest?
Yeah.
And it is not an easy question.
Yeah, and I think just my final point to shut up, the UN SDGs are talking about the world we want, yet we have never done an analysis of what the world would be like or how we could get there if we achieved every one of the 169 targets of the SDGs. And I think there is quite a lot of scope for creating a positive or a range of positive visions for the future. As one of my colleagues said to me the other day, and I keep on repeating this to people, so forgive me, in the 20th century we got rid of fascism and communism. Capitalism is really creaking. At the moment, all we've got left is pessimism. How do we turn that into a positive view of the future? Because all we're doing is saying to the youngsters, you can't drive, you can't fly, you can't eat meat, you can't do this, you can't do that. Where is the positive about having an economy built on well-being rather than just consumption growth? And what would it feel like? And would people really be worse off, or would they be better off? And there's quite a lot that we can do deliberatively, I think, from the science-based expert elicitation perspective, about saying that there are positive things in the future and having a positive vision. And then if we have a positive vision for the future, as Ian said, if we know where we want to be 2050, 2060, then it's possible to set a pathway from here to there rather than just react to the world as it changes bit by bit. Right, I think you've all heard far too much from me today, so I'm going to hand over to Susan to tie up with our representative from the Royal Society to talk about next steps and where we're going from here. Thanks very much, everybody, for your engagement.